Appendix C. New Theory of Vision, Experience of Persons Born Blind. Mr. Nunnally's valuable scientific treatise on The Organs of Vision, Their Anatomy and Physiology, 1858. The case was of a fine and most intelligent boy, 9 years of age, who had congenital cataract of both eyes, in whom the retina was more perfect than it commonly is at so advanced an age, as shown by the excellent sight he subsequently acquired. He had always lived in a very large manufacturing village about 16 miles from Leeds. He could find his way all about this place. Walking along the middle of the road, when he heard an object approaching, he at once stopped, groped his way to the side of the road, and remained perfectly still until it had passed. Anyone whom he knew, he was able to recognize by the sound of the voice and by passing his hands over the face and the body of the person. He could perceive the difference between a bright sunny and a dark cloudy day, and could follow the motions of a candle without discerning what it was. He had been sent to school for some time, and by means of models and a raised alphabet, could by touch alone arrange the different letters into short words. I presented to him in succession a great number of different objects, each one of which he took into both hands, felt it most carefully over with both, then with equal minuteness with one, turning the object over and over again in every direction. The tongue was next applied to it, and lastly he applied it so near to the eye as to touch the eyelids, when he pronounced his opinion upon it, and generally with correctness, as to the nature and form of the object, when these were distinct. Thus he recognized books, stones, small boxes, pieces of wood, and bone of different shapes, a broken piece of hard biscuit. A cube and a sphere he could readily recognize, saying that one was square and the other was round, and that both were made of wood. But a sphere which was made of perfectly smooth and hard wood, he was very confident was bone. In an object where the angles were not very distinct, he made constant mistakes in the shape, first saying it was square, then that it was round. Very bright light colors, when touching the eyelids, he could at once recognize, calling them all white, all dull and dark. Colors, he said, were black. Between a thin circle of wood and a sphere or a cube, he instantly decided by the hand alone. On putting half a crown piece into his hands, he immediately said it was money, but for long was undecided whether it was half a crown or a penny. However, after careful turning it over for some time, so as frequently to put every part into contact with the hand, then putting it to the tongue, and afterwards so close to the eye that it touched the eyeball itself, he said decidedly, "It is half a crown." The lenses were very large, milky, with caseous particles, quite white and opaque, the capsules being clear and transparent. As is well known, in most cases, before this period of life, the lens itself has been absorbed, leaving only a leathery, opaque capsule, and of course not nearly so favorable for such observations as this one. After keeping him in a dark room for several days until the opaque particles of lenses were nearly absorbed and the eyes clear, the same objects, which had been kept carefully from him, were again presented to his notice. He could at once perceive a difference in their shapes, although he could not in the least say which was the cube and which was the sphere. He saw they were not the same figure. It was not until they had many times been placed in his hands that he learnt to distinguish by the eye the one which he had just had in his hands from the other placed beside it. He gradually became more correct in his perception, but it was only after several days that he could or would tell by the eyes alone which was the sphere and which was the cube. When asked, he always, before answering, wished to take both into his hands. Even when this was allowed, when immediately afterwards the objects were placed before the eyes, he was not certain of the figure. Of distance he had not the least conception. He said everything touched his eyes, and walked most carefully about, with his hands held out before him, to prevent things hurting his eyes by touching them. Great care was requisite to prevent him from falling over objects or walking against them. Improvement gradually went on, and his subsequent sight was, and now is, comparatively perfect. An account of some observations made by a young gentleman who was born blind or who lost his sight so early that he had no remembrance of ever having seen, and was couched between 13 and 14 years of age, by Dr. Will Cheselden, surgeon to Her Majesty and to St. Thomas's Hospital. Though we say of the gentleman that he was blind, as we do of all people who have ripe cataracts, yet they are never so blind from that cause, but that they can discern day from night, and for the most part in a strong light distinguish black, white, and scarlet. But they cannot perceive the shape of anything, for the light by which these perceptions are made, being let in obliquely through the aqueous humour or the anterior surface of the crystalline, by which the rays cannot be brought into a focus upon the retina, they can discern in no other manner than a sound eye can through a glass of broken jelly, where a great variety of surfaces so differently refract the light that the several distinct pencils of rays cannot be collected by the eye into their proper foci, wherefore the shape of an object in such a case cannot be at all discerned, though the colour may. And thus it was with this young gentleman, who thought he knew these colours asunder in a good light, yet when he saw them after he was couched, the faint ideas he had of them before were not sufficient for him to know them by afterwards, and therefore he did not think them the same, which he had before known by those names. Now scarlet he thought the most beautiful of all colours, and of others the most gay were the most pleasing, whereas the first time he saw black, it gave him great uneasiness. When he first saw, he was so far from making any judgment about distances that he thought all objects whatever touched his eyes, as he expressed it, as what he felt did his skin, and thought no object so agreeable as those which were smooth and regular, though he could form no judgment of their shape, or guess what it was in any object that was pleasing to him. He knew not the shape of anything, nor any one thing from another, however different in shape or magnitude. But upon being told what things were, whose form he knew before from feeling, he would carefully observe that he might know them again. But, having too many objects to learn at once, he forgot many of them. And, as he said, at first he learned to know, and again forgot 1,000 things a day. One particular only, though it may appear trifling, I will relate. Having forgot which was the cat and which was the dog, he was ashamed to ask. But, catching the cat, which he knew by feeling, he was observed to look at her steadfastly, and then, setting her down, said, "So, puss, I shall know you another time." He was very much surprised that those things which he had liked best did not appear most agreeable to his eyes, expecting those persons would appear most beautiful that he loved most, and such things to be most agreeable to his sight that were so to his taste. He thought he soon knew what pictures represented which were showed to him, but we found afterwards we were mistaken, for about 2 months after he was couched, he discovered at once they represented solid bodies, when to that time he'd considered them only as parti-coloured planes or surfaces diversified with a variety of paint. But even then he was no less surprised, expecting the pictures would feel like the things they represented, and was amazed when he found those parts which by their light and shadow appeared now round and uneven, felt only flat like the rest, and asked which was the lying sense, feeling or seeing. Being shown his father's picture in a locket at his mother's watch, and told what it was, he acknowledged the likeness, but was vastly surprised, asking how it could be that a large face could be expressed in so little room, saying, it should have seemed as impossible to him as to put a bushel of anything into a pint. At first he could bear but very little sight, and the things he saw he thought extremely large. But upon seeing things larger, those first seen, he conceived less, never being able to imagine any lines beyond the bounds he saw. The room he was in, he said, he knew to be but part of the house, yet he could not conceive that the whole house could look bigger. Before he was couched, he expected little advantage from seeing, worth undergoing an operation for, except reading and writing. For he said he thought he could have no more pleasure in walking abroad than he had in the garden, which he could do safely and readily. And even blindness, he observed, had this advantage, that he could go anywhere in the dark much better than those who can see. And after he had seen, he did not soon lose this quality, nor desire a light to go about the house in the night. He said every new object was a new delight, and the pleasure was so great that he wanted ways to express it. But his gratitude to his operator he could not conceal. Never seeing him for some time without tears of joy in his eyes and other marks of affection. And if he did not happen to come at any time when he was expected, he would be so grieved that he could not forbear crying at his disappointment. A year after first seeing, being carried upon Epsom Downs and observing a large prospect, he was exceedingly delighted with it and called it a new kind of seeing. And now, being lately couched of his other eye, he says that objects at first appeared large to this eye, but not so large as they did at first to the other. In looking upon the same object with both eyes, he thought it looked about twice as large as with the first couched eye only, but not double, that we can any ways discover.